So, Richard, how does a 17-year-old end up working at Abbey Road?
Well, it's a very good question, and I can just about remember. I basically started because I used to play guitar. My mum and dad bought me an acoustic guitar, and there wasn't a lot of guitar music around at the time to learn. So I bought a Shadow. I had a Shadows album and a Chet Atkins album, and the Shadows album on the back of it had a write-up for a recording session. And I thought, oh, that sounds quite interesting. I wonder, not knowing how they recorded anything. And so I wrote a letter, like one does, or one did back then. There was no universities, no colleges for audio. And they sent me a letter back saying, would you like to come in for an interview? So I walked across the crossing, went into the building, did an interview, and they didn't have a job at the time. And I was working part-time for a builder, a friend of my father's. And then about 3 months later, I got a letter from Abbey Road saying, or from EMI as it was called, EMI Studios it was called back then. And I went back for another interview, and the rest was history.
But it was an unusual way to learn the job because you were T-boy,
You basically did... Well, it's a huge building. It doesn't look like that from the front, but it's got about 4 studios in it. It's got copying rooms. It's got editing rooms. So it's quite a big building. So to figure out what actually goes on in the building, they put us in the tape library, which is where they stored all of the tapes. And I had to go. 2 of us started on the same day, and we had to go into studios, we had to go into all the different rooms and drop tapes off and pick tapes up. So that was our job, and that was where I learnt. And you'd see how a tape box was written up, how I went from writing 2s and 7s differently on boxes because people would get confused with numbers. So I was doing my 7s with a line across it now, ever since 1965. And so that's how it all started. And then eventually I got on to becoming a tape op.
But in fact,
it was button pusher.
It was a matter of a few weeks. You go from making tea and running tapes to suddenly being remixing Rubber Soul.
Yes, it probably was that long. Short. It was very quickly, you were suddenly there, and then, the rest of my life was catching up with sleep.
But I know that you weren't a Beatles fan at first. You're actually more of a Shadows fan.
Yeah, I was a Shadows and a Stones fan. At school, you were either a Beatles or a Stones geezer, and I was a Stones man because everybody was Beatle people.
Well, that said, it was more John, Paul and George rather than Mick and Keith.
Yes.
But that said, there must have been those pinch-yourself moments.
Oh, it was. I can remember. Everybody says, oh, what was it like and all this sort of thing. I can remember standing on St John's Wood Station on the way home once, and I thought, God, that's a pretty cool job. I think I'd been doing Cliff Richard, Shirley Bassey and the Beatles in 1 week. And I thought, well, that's, this mate of mine at school was at a bank, working in a bank. And I thought, yeah, I don't know whether I could cope with that. I think I've definitely picked the right job.
I think you did, Richard.
And history has proved that I was right.
What were your first impressions of the Beatles?
Cheeky. That's probably it. I think cheeky, different. They were different from the probably more humorous, more adventurous in music than other people.
Certainly, John was.
Yeah, they were a lot different. Most other bands would literally come in, play the song live, and then go home. It was very, very quick. It was an easy process. It was almost like a live recording, because they would set up and, you know, Freddie and the Dreamers, he was a little short geezer. He'd stand on a little box and sing his song, get off his box and go home. Whereas the Beatles would spend a lot more time. It was certainly from Rubber Soul onwards.
George Harrison?
George Harrison, kind, thoughtful. Yeah, he gave me a jacket once, and he was always very, you know, he bought me some food in once. He knew that we didn't eat a lot, and he was a nice guy. Paul, perfectionist. Like he was very thorough in doing everything. Would do vocals until they were right. Would do the bass for probably 3 hours or 4 hours until that was right.
Ringo.
I felt sorry for Ringo, because he worked out of all of them. He worked when you were doing a backing track for a song, which is just the basic bed of a song. He would play drums for about 6 or 7 hours, sometimes more or less non-stop. And so he worked very, very hard, and he'd walk up the stairs, open the door and struggle through and just say, "Good night." So he was good. I mean, he was a fabulous drummer, but he worked bloody hard for his money.
John Lennon. Impatient. Very impatient.
Impatient
with you?
Not only with me, just impatient. I mean, he would want to sing something quickly, and he did sing something quickly. I mean, all of them sang in tune, brilliantly in tune. So there would be none of this drop. There wasn't a lot of dropping things in. But he was very impatient, you know, and sometimes he'd get a bit irritable, you know.
For a classic rock and roll singer, though, he seemed to have an impatience with his own voice, and he asked you to make it something different all the time.
Always different. Like he says, no, I don't want to. When we did Iron the Walrus, which was later on, you know, he said, "Oh, I had that mic yesterday. I don't want to use that mic. Tell Jeff I want a different one, and I don't want to sound like I did yesterday." Well, no other artist. I don't think I've ever worked with anybody else that ever said that, because they always want to sound like whoever they are, you know.
You're a pretty young man. You're 17, 18. You had Jeff Emmerich, who was the other engineer. He was 21.
Yeah.
And the old man,
George Martin.
He was only in his mid-30s. But
he was, yeah, that's right. He was. I think we worked out he was 38 when we did Pepper. And everybody, I mean, the Beatles and us thought he was so old. You know, he was so old and square. And he wasn't really old well, he was in a way old and square, but he was, I mean, it was like a meeting of minds. George was perfect for them, because they wanted to go outside of the square. And George was always a bit like that, you know, and George was there were certain songs that were perfect for George. Mm. Anything that had sound effects or anything where they wanted something a bit different, then George would sort of, you know, rub his hands together and go, "Great, you know, we'll do this, and can you go and get these tapes, Richard, and we'll fly those in." And, you know, he was because he'd done those sort of records. He'd done a lot of comedy records. So.
Yeah. And did you get on with George?
Yeah, he was all right. I mean, he used to, because we were so young, he had a term. He would always say, "Oh, honestly, Richard. Oh, honestly." And
was it your sense of humour or your techniques?
No, well, I think the sense of humour, and we'd be doing something, if we had flanging or something to do on a track, I would always try and do more than would be probably acceptable. And George would just go, "Oh, honestly, Richard, honestly."
Do you think he should have let you eat occasionally?
Well, yes. I mean, we missed out on a lot of dinners because we were working, and he was very loath for us both to not be there together. One of us could pop out and get something to eat quickly, but it either had to be Jeff or I. It couldn't be both of us together.
Well, take us through a typical session.
Typical session. Well, you never really knew. The interesting thing was they'd say, right, we'll start at 2 o'clock tomorrow. So you'd walk down the road, come to the crossing, and there'd be no fans, no girls out the front. So you'd know immediately, never did find out who told them, that there wouldn't be anything happening for a while. And then there'd be no roadies, there'd be nobody, no George Martin. So then, I sort of learnt to play the piano during that period of time, fiddling around. And then gradually the fans would arrive. So they might arrive 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock. So you'd think, well, that's another hour before the Beatles are here. The roadies would come, and then you'd say to Mal or Neil, when are they coming? What are we doing? Oh, dunno. Maybe about an hour. So there'd be, and then maybe Ringo would come. So they'd all come separately, unless John and Paul had been writing at Paul's house, which was just up the road. And then eventually they'd all be there, and that would take, that might be 7 o'clock. So you'd actually start 7:30, something like that, and quite often be there till 6:30, 7 in the morning.
So you'd been there since 2 p.m. the previous day.
Well, that's right.
You worked through the night.
Yeah.
And when did you have dinner?
Well, that was it. I mean, you were lucky to get a hot dog in a polythene bag out of a microwave.
Not that you had microwaves then, did you?
Well, we did. We had this sort of very strange machine that it was either sort of burnt to a cinder or cold, and so we did have. Whether that was on the start of Pepper or the end of Pepper, I can't remember.
But the Beatles were pretty well fed.
Yeah, they used to get dinner brought in, lovely smelling curries and everything, but not for us, not for the workers.
Okay, so take us through the album now. Like, it was a pretty extraordinary time for the Beatles. They decided that they wouldn't tour anymore.
Yeah, which was a main catalyst for the album, because therefore they could do whatever they wanted. It was a meeting of the right people. Jeff was an engineer that wanted to try things. There was no budget, there was no time period, there was no deadline for it to be finished. So it really was a carte blanche. We could have a 40-piece orchestra, we could do anything we wanted. And until everybody was happy, it wasn't finished. And it had never been like that. And no other artist ever had that. That they all either had to be on tour the next day or back up in Manchester doing a TV interview or something. So consequently, it turned out being, I think 400 hours it was altogether.
Had its perks for people like you, though, because you were always on call. You had a long time to wait in between them turning up and you starting.
Well, Jeff and I were making a lot of money. We were making more money than the manager of the studios.
In overtime?
In overtime. We were getting double time on Sundays, and a lot of the sessions after 9:30 you got double time. So, it was great. I was buying nice clothes and eventually going on holidays. And
when they gave you some time off?
When they gave us time off. And it was a very lucrative period.
So let's go through some of the tracks. Obviously, the sessions actually started with Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane. They were taken from the album to make that famous single.
Yeah.
But the opening track, Sgt Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Do you remember that? That
was done, I think, Pepper, yes, as you said, Pepper started with Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane, and another another tape op did that before me, and that's when I started just after that. They'd half done Day in the Life. They'd done a little bit of that. And the first proper track that I did totally was Pepper. It was the reprise of Pepper, or the main track of Pepper.
The
track. Reprise was one of the last ones we did, and Pepper was the first track we did.
And the reprise you remember fondly?
And the reprise I remember fondly because it was just one of those special nights when they were playing great. They were all there together, which didn't always happen. And we were in a different studio. We were in number 1 studio, which is the main classical studio, which normally didn't have pop music done in it. And we built little houses for everybody to sort of be close to each other in, and it was just the vibe, them playing that night was fantastic.
Something special.
It was brilliant. I'd love to be able to have that on video somewhere.
Do you think it would be just the fact that they were going on holidays? And
a bit of that, but every now and then they would really be like that. Like there's a couple of other songs on the White Album where they were like that, and it's just a moment, you know, when a band's really firing, you know.
But it's also an album, though, where Paul McCartney said, well, look, we're not touring anymore, so let's let the album tour. So there was something very special about it. It's groundbreaking in that way, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, every aspect of it, from the cover to the songs to the way it was all put together, was totally different to what everybody else was doing at the time.
So by this stage, do you think you'd become a bit of a fan, or were you still more of a Stones man?
I guess one was, yeah. I mean, we ended up... I mean, I can remember once Day in the Life was finished, everybody felt very proud of it. And, you know, I think John and Paul were pretty pleased as punch with the song and the way. And if anybody ever came in, be it, you know, Mick Jagger or whoever, we always George Martin would always say, "Oh, can you put on the mix of Day in the Life, Richard? You know, can you put it on, please?" And so we always used to play that, and you just look at the people's faces and they, oh, where's this going next, you know?
What was it about the song that was so monumental?
Just that it was different, I think. It was different, I mean, apart from the orchestra. I mean, the more we put on it, the better it kind of got. And then the problem was we'd put so much on it, well, we ended up with 2 reels of tape that we had to lock together somehow, and that was our challenge, to get these 2 tape machines running together. And because the orchestra stopped between, you know, the first verse and the second verse, etc., if it was getting a little bit out of time, I could speed it up a little bit, and then you cross your fingers and hope that when it came in for the next bit, it was in time, you know. So there was a little bit of skullduggery going on.
Was it a gobsmacking song right from the start when you first heard it?
It was. I mean, I first heard it when in a very basic stage. It was John and his guitar, and John's vocal, of course, was amazing. I mean, every time I hear it, it just sends shivers down my spine. And Paul played piano on it, and there was some drums. And then from there, the middle section, Woke Up, Fell Out of Bed, wasn't written. So Paul did that sort of later on, after about a week, I think, of the song being started. And then we put the orchestra on, and then we glued the pianos at the end on. We got every piano in the building, in the studio, and every person that could play the chord, even people that couldn't play the piano, were playing this chord to make it sound huge. I mean, there was no such thing as doing something normal on that track.
No,
and
nothing.
And then the hardest thing was actually mixing it, because we had the orchestra on one machine, on one tape, and we had the backing track and singing on another. So we had to lock those together.
And this is part of the artistry, isn't it? Like nowadays we're looking at 64 track, 128 track.
Endless.
Endless. I mean, but you were dealing with 4 tracks to build a complicated soundscape.
And 4-track is great. I love it because it actually forces you to make decisions, and it actually makes you get things right there and then. I mean, I have a problem now with having so many tracks. You end up doing all these options, and then somewhere down the line you have to make a decision. But you've got too many decisions. And 4-track was great like that. It actually made you, apart from the fact it sounded great, the machine sounded great, it actually forced you to do good things. And if it wasn't any good, well, you couldn't afford to have a track with something bad on it. It had to be something good, or maybe 2 things that were good,
And some of the sound effects were actually down to you as the tape operator, taking sound from different parts of the tape machine.
That's right.
Is that what flanging was?
Flanging was, that was John's word. He made up that word. Flanging was there's a bit of a grey area. Flanging, it was started off as double tracking, ADT, automatic double tracking. And it basically meant that instead of John singing something exactly the same, you could actually do it via a tape machine with a bit of wizardry. And depending what speed you ran that tape machine at, you could phase it or flange it. So depending what the signal was, if it was an acoustic guitar, for instance, that was being played quite slowly, you could flange that, and John loved that. John loved that sound, and he always used to say, "Oh, can you flange it, Richard? Can you flange it more?" And so that was my job in life.
So in effect, you're adding body to a sound, or making it a bit
and
different.
Just making it anything but normal. Normal is not good. Normal is not allowed on a Beatle record.
But that's what made them different to the Hollies and other people you worked with.
Exactly. I mean, it was. Everything couldn't be normal.
Talking about not normal, what about Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds? That was another groundbreaking song.
Lucy was, that was a prime example of flanging, whatever one would call it, double tracking. And I can still hear George Martin shouting out the note, because I used to send it from the 4 tracks on my tape machine. I would send each track, depending what was on it, to the machine to be flanged. So George would shout out, 2 down, Richard, 3 up, 4 down, 2 up. So he would be, and this would go on for like 3 or 4 hours. So you just get brainwashed to be which part of the song you would do. And then when we came to mix it in stereo, we'd sort of forgotten what we're going to do. So it kind of, when I hear the stereo, I think, oh, we haven't got the flanging on that verse. Oh, we didn't. And because it was sort of done in a bit of a rush, at the end of the album, it kind of, the stereo is the one you hear on the radio, but the mono is the Bible. The mono
in fact,
is the
because one. I think many viewers wouldn't realise that Sgt Pepper's was actually meant to be a mono album.
It was mono right up until it was nearly finished. And then somebody from EMI, because all pop music all came out in mono. Classical music was out in stereo. And then somebody said, oh, we're going to bring Pepper out in stereo. And there was a lot of sort of grunting and groaning and, oh, God, we've got to mix it all again. So that was George Martin, Jeff and I's task. We had to go and mix everything all over again in stereo.
basically create another album as it is, in many ways.
Well, that's right. And then try to remember, I mean, I had notes with speeds of tape machines and things like that written on a bit of paper, but there were some things that sort of didn't get done as well as they were on the mono. So the mono is the only one to listen to, ever.
Viewers, listen to that.
Yes, ever. Don't ever go in any other direction.
In what other ways were you breaking to the rules of technology with this album?
Gosh. Well, I guess using different instruments. I mean, we used different instruments than normal. I mean, we used an orchestra. We used She's Leaving Home. We got a lady playing the harp. So, I mean, that was George Martin's baby, doing the orchestra. George Martin's baby was also doing backing vocals. He would arrange, you know, he would come up with ideas for the various songs for backing vocals. Paul was pretty good in that department too, but George would always work the notes out on the piano and teach them what to sing.
George Harrison also, he was tolerated, was he, on that album? Or?
He was tolerated. I mean, he got given his song, Within You, Without You, and we had a lot of fun recording that, especially mixing it. We sort of put a lot of flanging on his sitar. And
I think that was the first time that you had a modern sound that involved both Indian and classical.
Yes,
and rock music.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was quite adventurous for its time, and the strings. And I think it's a great blend of East and West, East meets West, as it were.
And you don't remember the other Beatles being there for that session?
No, they were never there. There was one, if you listen very carefully, at the end of one of the sections, there's a little bit of tambourine. Now, somebody walked in to the studio while we were doing whatever it was, picked up a tambourine and just played along. And that's the only bit of an exclusive here. That's the only piece of somebody else other than George or his Indian friends.
Who was that?
I don't know.
Not much of an exclusive then,
Don't
is it?
know. It's an exclusive, but it was either John or Paul or Ringo. So they walked in downstairs, and we couldn't see, you know, who did it. But I thought, oh, there's a tambourine playing along. Who's doing that?
Now, every Beatles album, had a Ringo song.
Yeah.
With a Little Help from My Friends was the song.
My God, yes. Yes, great song, great bass, and the vocal we did. Every time I think of that song, I think of Ringo standing there in number 2 on the microphone with John and Paul. John and Paul standing next to him, sort of conducting him and egging him on and thumbs up and come on. And this was about 6 a.m. He was told to do that vocal. And we dropped the end in the last Friends on the track probably about 15 times, 20 times.
Because he didn't have a great deal of confidence in his own singing.
No, and I mean, he was I should probably call him an okay singer. But he actually did quite well on that. And it was quite funny. I saw him live a couple of years ago singing it, and I felt it was a weird feeling seeing him singing it live on stage, 45 years after.
Yes, I might have been at the same concert, actually.
Well, it was very weird. It was a strange feeling.
What was it about that song that he struggled with?
Well, mainly the last note. I mean, the last note was the problem, mainly because it was high. And, I mean, anybody singing a long note, one pitch, is quite hard to do, unless you're Pavarotti or something. But
how did it go again?
With a little help from my friends.
And so 7 o'clock in the morning, poor Ringo has been told after another sleepless night, right, your time to sing it.
Yeah, exactly. It suddenly came out of the blue. I mean, nobody, we thought we were going home. And then we suddenly got, oh, no, Ringo's going to do With Little Help from Our Friends now. Oh, really?
That song has also got a really great bass line, and one thing about the Beatles was that it always had a very melodic bass line from Paul.
Yeah.
How did he do that?
He did that right at the end. I mean, there was no bass on that track until the very end, and there again, it's one of those things that sort of is in my mind forever. I can remember being in the control room. Paul played it in the control room with the lead going down to the studio, and we spent about three or 4 hours doing that, each little bit, and he'd play it, and then he'd look up, and you'd know you had to do it again, and then he'd play it, and he'd look up again, and I can just remember him looking at me, you know, for all that time, looking at me, thought, oh, he likes that one, yeah, okay, you want to hear it back, you know, and he'd smile, and then, you know, he liked it, and then you'd move on a little bit more. But it was, and in fact, I saw him, I don't know, 15 years ago or something, and I said, we were talking about bass, I said, With Little Help from My Friends, it's pretty good, you know. And he was quite sort of chuffed, you know. I mean, he knows it was, you know, one of the highlights of his performances, but it took a while to do.
Now, just as Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was inspired, John was inspired by a painting that his son had done. He had a 5-year-old son at the time. Being for the benefit of Mr. Kite was based on a poster he had in his house.
That's right. I mean, John had a vision of this thing. You know, it was very technicolor, and, you know, we've got to capture that. George Martin, this is your job. You know, what do we do? And George had a bit of a think about it, and we did the basic backing track. We had Ringo, George Martin played harmonium, and it went on sort of forever. And the harmonium, for those people that don't know what it is, it's actually a pipe organ, and you have 2 pedals that you have to keep going. So you're pedaling this thing like a bicycle with your feet to get any sound. Otherwise, nothing comes out. So that pushes the bellows. So George Martin was playing that, and he got so, I mean, this was like 2 a.m. or something, and I can just see him lying on the floor with his he was just so knackered. And then we ended up with Mal, the roadie, then sort of was lying on the floor face down, pushing these pedals with his hands. So it was quite interesting. George was sitting at the keyboard, and Mal was sort of underneath his legs, just pushing these pedals, you know.
Mal Evans being, of course, the old roadie for the Beatles,
That's
their best
right.
friend.
God bless him. Mal and Neil, the two foot soldiers that were there all the time for them.
And is that one of your favourite songs, being for the benefit of Miss Kite?
I think it is. I mean, I think Kite and Day in the Life, out of all the Beatles songs, I think are kind of ones, you know, they bring back sort of memories of what actually happened on the day. And, you know, there's always, you always like, I think Jeff likes Day in the Life, you know, we just love the vocal, you know, and the way the tape echo works on the vocal, and John always used to like that to work with, you know, he couldn't sing unless he had the echo in the cans, so it actually went down with the vocal, you know, so he played on it, so to speak.
The Beatles at the time were 4 very excitable young men, but when they turned up in the studio sometimes, did you think they were a bit too overexcited, or that they might have been under the influence of some
Yes, I mean, there was a little bit of smoking going on over the period of time. Not every day, not every night, but, I mean, you could always tell once the joss sticks, started happening downstairs. I mean, I used to go down and change mics and move mics for Jeff, and you go down there and I used to wind them up, and say, oh, it smells nice down here, and I think they really did think we were really green, which was, and George Martin I think George used to kind of keep it from us too. It was quite funny what was going on, and he thought that, the two kids didn't know what was going on. Well, hello.
So in a funny way, they were very protective of you, Richard. Like they weren't that much older than you.
No, well, I think they were about. Maybe Ringo was 24.
Well,
Maybe
I think John
Ringo
would have been
was
27.
24.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Ringo was I think. Get me right. I mean, there's all these people out there that would know, but I think Ringo was the oldest, and I think John was the next, and I think they were maybe 24, 25. And Jeff was 21, I was 18. So
they were trying to protect your virtue by
maybe
with the
they
joss
were.
sticks.
Maybe they were. Maybe.
Now, tell us about your pay.
My pay, £7 a week. £7 a week I got when I started. And if you work with the Beatles on a good week, especially if they came in on a Sunday, if they came in on a Saturday and Sunday, you go home with 40 quid sometimes, 40, 50 quid. So it was pretty good working for them.
Baby, you're a rich man.
Yeah, something like that. I mean, it wasn't every week, but no, we sort of made some good money on those. There wasn't we didn't have a union, but there wasn't like an engineers union, but we got double time on a Sunday, double time after 9:30. So time and a half on a Saturday.
You did the Sgt Pepper's reprise of the last recording, then it was mixing, then it was finished. How did you feel?
We felt weird. I can remember at the time thinking, God, what do we do now? We've spent all this time sort of doing this, and it wasn't constant. I mean, it wasn't. But I did actually look in a book yesterday and saw that we actually did Magical Mystery Tour yesterday, 50 years ago. So it's sort of quite interesting.
Is it gobsmacking to you that it's so long ago?
It is and it isn't. I mean, because the songs were so good and so memorable to record, it doesn't seem as long ago as what it is. I mean, it doesn't seem 50 years. I mean, 50 years is a long time. It doesn't seem that long. It seems maybe 30. It doesn't seem 50. It makes me feel older than what I am.
And in fact, for many of those 50 years you've been in Australia, you've lived here for more than 40 years.
Oh, well, when I was 50, I'd been 25 in England and 25 here, so that was a big groundbreaking period.
Still got your accent.
Well, I guess, not quite as well as Scottish. Scottish people really seem to keep their accents more than Londoners.
Richard, it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew. Thank you.